Well, good morning. Welcome to AEI. I'm really excited about today's event. My name is Ryan Streeter. I'm the Director of Domestic Policy Studies here at the American Enterprise Institute. And it's a real privilege to welcome all of you and my friend Richard Reeves to talk about his book of Boys and Men today. It's an incredibly timely book. It's a very illuminating book, as I think you'll see if you haven't had a chance to read it yet. If, like me, you have people in your extended family and friend network who maybe on the one hand didn't go to college, and on the other hand maybe are in or just got out of college, you often find yourselves in conversations with people about what's going on with men these days and what's going on with young men these days. It seems to be a common topic at the pub, around the dinner table. And it's into that kind of questioning time that we're in about this issue that Richard comes with some answers in his book of Boys and Men, Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why It Matters, and What to Do About It. And if you've ever had a chance to have coffee with Richard or work formally with him in a working group, you'll know that he is incredibly collegial and thoughtful, spirited, very civil in his way of disagreeing, open-minded and empirically grounded, and that will be reflected in his remarks about the book. Richard Reeves is the John C. and Nancy D. Whitehead Chair at the Brookings Institution, right next door, and I'm really glad that he can be here today as he rolls out his book. Before I bring Richard up to the stage, I did want to just say, for those of you who are not in the room and are watching on the live stream, you can also send questions in that we'll tabulate, and during the discussion later, be able to pose those to Richard and to his discussants. You can do that one of two ways. One is by email. You can send them to thomas.o'rourke@aei.org. That's thomas.o''rourke at aei.org. Or on Twitter, hashtag #BoysAndMenAEI. So feel free at any time to send in questions, and when we turn to our panelists later, those questions can be entertained at that time. So what we're going to do is Richard's going to come up and give some remarks with a presentation, and then he will be joined in a discussion moderated by my AEI colleague Scott Winship, and joined by my AEI colleague Beth Akers and Kay Hymowitz from the Manhattan Institute. A really great group of people to be talking about these issues today. So please welcome Richard Reeves with me this morning to the stage. Thanks.
Thanks, Ryan. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Ryan, and thank you all for coming. Let me just put my coffee down. It's a great privilege and a great honor to be able to speak on this subject on this stage. I see many friends and colleagues in the audience, so thank you for coming, and thank you to all of those who are watching online. And a particular thanks to Thomas O'Rourke, who's done a lot of work to put this event together, as well, of course, as Ryan and Scott. So I have about 20 minutes allocated in the schedule. I plan to use no more than that, and hopefully a little bit less, because I'm very anxious to get to the conversation. And one of the difficulties, of course, when you write at book length, and this is one of my first, perhaps the first formal presentation of the book, is deciding what not to say. Because, of course, I have a lot to say on the subject. And so finding a way to actually be reasonably tight with my time has been a challenge. But I'm going to rattle through some of the arguments in the book and some key data points. But before I do that, I want to explain a little bit why I would write this book, because I'm hardly the first to write on the subject. This is Hannah Rosen's book from 2012, The End of Men and the Rise of Women. I think it's important to note for the record that Hannah herself has recanted some of the arguments she makes in this book, and has not really written much on it since, but it did make quite a splash at the time. This book from Kay Hymowitz, who we're about to hear from, Manning Up, also made a big impression on me. There is this book from Phil Zimbardo and his colleague Nikita Kullum, Man Interrupted. There's Man Out, also from the Brookings Institution Press, as is my book, from Andrew Yarrow, and The Boy Crisis from Warren Farrell and John Gray. So it's not as if there aren't books on this subject. So anybody entering into a subject like this, where there have been many books written, many papers written, many op-eds written, really has to have a good reason for doing so. Why this? Why yet another book on boys and men? And I'm going to give you the intellectual or political reasons in a moment, but I want to start a little bit autobiographically. One of my convictions is that all scholarship is autobiographical in one way or another. Sometimes it's just in the choice of subject, sometimes it's the approach you bring, and I think it's important to put that on the table. So one reason I wrote this book is that I've raised 3 boys. now in their 20s, I use this photograph of them because this was the last time I was taller than all of them. And now with one exceptional taller than me, which is something as a father that you just have to glory in and accept that they're going to come past you. This is a few years ago. So that's George, Bryce, and Cameron, and the book is dedicated to them. And the conversations about what it means to be a boy in the education system, both in the UK and then in the US, what it means to be a young man at college and in the labor market, what it means to be a young man in the romantic market, has been the fuel of many dinner party and dinner table conversations, I should say. And so I'm looking at it somewhat through that lens, even though, I'll be honest, it's not the sons of Brookings Institution scholars I'm most worried about from a socioeconomic perspective. But I have to say that my view of what it means to answer these questions has been influenced by and informed by my sons. But let me just say a little bit more before I dive into some of the charts, which is what I'm going to do in a moment. Let me give you the 6 intellectual reasons why I decided to write the book. Number 1, I knew that there were some problems for boys and men, but things were worse than I thought. As I dug into some of the data on some of the things I'm about to talk about in education and employment, I kept having those, what social scientists call the wait, what moments. Hold on. Can someone check those figures again? There are a number that I'm about to share, but some of them were things like the fact that college enrollment dropped 7 times more for men than women in 2020. Now, there's complicated reasons for that. Partly it's about the supply side, the kinds of courses that men were doing, largely in community college. But nonetheless, when I stumbled across that in whatever it was, Table 3 of Appendix 2 of an NCES report, I was like, wait, what? Because it wasn't getting any attention. And across a whole range of metrics, I kept thinking, yeah, I knew things had gotten bad for some men and boys, but I didn't realize how bad. So number 1 was just the wait, what? Okay, I knew some of this. I learned more. The second is that when you look at the issues faced by boys and men, by boys and men through a class and a race lens, a very different picture emerges than if you just look around on our own class. And so working class men, and black boys and men in particular, face the sharpest end of many of the social and economic trends that we're going to talk about today. And my fear is that if we only look around us within particularly privileged circumstances, we miss what's happening lower down the economic spectrum. We might be leaning in, but we're not looking down. And once you start to do that, what you see is the story of gender has to be seen through a race and a class lens too. So that was the second reason. The third was that when I looked at the challenges faced by boys and men, especially those I've just referred to, I kept seeing structural challenges. I kept seeing an education system that in many ways wasn't really working for many of our boys and men. I saw a labor market that had changed quite profoundly in ways that had disproportionately affected male jobs. And I saw changes in family life and family structure that ran the risk of benching many of our men. I kept seeing structural challenges, but all I ever encountered was individualistic diagnoses and solutions. What I kept hearing was that any problems with boys and men was a problem of boys and men, or the other way around. The key point is it was always about them. It was about the fact that they weren't adapting quickly enough. They were too toxic. They were too masculine. Or they weren't masculine enough. Take your pick, depending on your political priors. But at every stage, I saw it being put on the shoulders of men themselves. They needed to shape up in one way or another. And that seemed to me to be wrong. It seemed to me to be empirically wrong. I thought there were structural challenges facing them. Now, that is not to say, and I have to emphasize this particularly here, that I'm in any way abdicating individual responsibility. I've not said to my own sons, yeah, there's a lot of structural challenges facing you, so you're screwed. No. I do want individual responsibility, but this is an area where uniquely, left and right, for very different reasons, agree on an individualistic analysis of the problem rather than a structural one. And so I emphasize the structural problems faced by boys and men. The next reason was that I stumbled across, and I won't say it any more strategically than that, stumbled across a whole bunch of evaluations of interventions that found good results for girls and women, but nil results for boys and men. The one that really jumped off the desk, just down down the road at the Brookings Institution, was an evaluation of the Kalamazoo Promise, a free college program in Kalamazoo, Michigan, one of the most generous in the country, full tuition paid for all students graduating from Kalamazoo high schools, which increased female college completion by about 50% and increased male college completion by nothing. The ROI for men was well into negative numbers. It's one of the most generous college promise schemes, but it's also really one of the best evaluated by Brad Hirschbaum and his team at the Upjohn Institute. And that really got me thinking. So I went to Kalamazoo, interviewed as many young men as I could find, both in and out of the college system, to try and get at what was happening there. And I talk a bit about this in the book, because I have to devote a chapter to this question. A lot of it's about motivation and incentives, which I'll come to in a moment. But then I looked at a mentoring scheme in community colleges, a school choice scheme in Charlotte, and it seemed like a lot of the people doing those evaluations knew this. It was kind of known that there were a lot of interventions that had this pattern, which was they worked for girls and women, but not for boys and men. That struck me as something that wasn't getting enough attention. I also felt the next reason is that we weren't having a very good quality political conversation about this. Now, of course, you could say that about pretty much everything. But in this particular area, what I felt was that both left and right had dug into zero-sum positions, and for different reasons were failing to responsibly engage with the problems of boys and men. On the left, the problem was that either men were toxic, and so it was their fault. We had a lot of that in the pandemic when men were at much higher risk of dying from COVID, or an unwillingness to even admit that there could be problems for boys and men given the remaining issues facing girls and women. And so there's an asymmetry, a form of progressive blindness to the problems of boys and men. But on the right, what I felt was happening was a willingness to at least acknowledge some of the problems, but then without any real solutions. What the right are tending to do is to say, yeah, we feel your pain, this is difficult, and then to somehow imagine there's a magic wand that can bring back the world as it used to be. The world of traditional marriages, manufacturing jobs, etc. No real solutions. And so at worst, those on the populist right especially are in danger of exploiting the difficulties faced by boys and men and turning real problems into political grievances. It may marshal votes, but it doesn't bring any solutions. And that's the last reason I wrote the book, was because I felt I wanted to offer some solutions. Much of the previous work in this area has been quite long on lamentation, but quite short on solution. And that is not a criticism necessarily of those who did a good job of highlighting many of the problems of boys and men. But what I wanted to do was have a solutions-forward debate. Yascha Mounk, the political scientist, talks about what he calls the Chapter 11 problem of all nonfiction books. The Chapter 11 problem is you spend 10 chapters explaining in great detail how the world is going to hell in a handcart, and then your editor says, well, you have to have some solutions. You can't just leave people with that, and so you write Chapter 11, and you put a few solutions in there, usually universal pre-K, just so that you can say that there is some, or apprenticeships. By the way, I also call for more apprenticeships. So that there is some kind of solution there. But I have 3 pretty wonky chapters on solutions, and I'm briefly going to describe them in a moment. But I wanted to have a debate about solutions. I want people to say, no, this is not, if I have an argument with people, I want it to be like, I wouldn't do this, I'd do that. But to move this into the solution space rather than just the problem space. So with that, I am going to rattle through at pretty high speed some stats, some charts, and some data, simply to help ground the conversation which we're about to have. I will not cover everything that's in the book, and for those who want to get the PowerPoint slides, I haven't had time to put all of the sources on every slide. They are in the book, and I will add a slide which will have all the sources for those who want to follow up. So in education, the story is reasonably well known, but just to put the data on the table, this shows you the gender gap in degrees. So what we're looking at is how many women per 100 men getting a bachelor's degree or a master's degree. And we start at the beginning of the 1970s when Title IX was passed. And what you see is pretty big gaps in favor of men. In terms of BA, there's about a 13 percentage point gap in favor of men in 1972 when Title IX was passed to promote women and girls. Fast forward to today, and there's a 15 percentage point gap in favor of women. You can see that the trends are similar for those with a postgraduate degree too. And so the headline here is that there is a bigger gender gap in US higher education today than there was in 1972 when Title IX was passed. It's just the other way around. It's also worth noting here that no one expected the line to keep going up that way. We were pushing quite rightly for more gender parity, but there was really no discussion at the time of, well, what if the lines just keep going? What if we do get gender inequality the other way around? Does it matter? Will we care? The conversation wasn't had because nobody expected it. Why is that happening? Well, one reason is that girls are leaving boys behind in high school. Girls have always been ahead in high school, but now they're really far ahead, rather. So this ranks high school GPA by decile, and what it shows you is that among those with the highest GPAs, on the right-hand side, the top 10% by high school GPA, 2/3 are girls, the bottom 10%, 2/3 are boys, and a pretty linear relationship in between. And of course, high school GPA is both a good measure of and predictor of educational performance generally. Why is that? Well, this is work from Julia Isaacs from the Brookings Institution, which shows that boys are less likely to be school ready than girls. The bars that are highlighted are the ones that add the controls for other socioeconomic variables and show that actually, based on this analysis anyway, there's actually a bigger gap between girls and boys than any other gap that she found. So boys start behind and stay behind. I don't have a chart for this, but I would draw your attention to work that Ember Smith and I have done recently looking at gender gaps across US states and showing how girls have overtaken boys in math and of course well ahead in English. In the typical school district today, girls are almost a grade level in the US, girls are almost a grade level ahead in English and have overtaken in math. In the poorest school districts, they're way ahead in both. One reason for this is neuroscience. So this is work from Larry Steinberg, Catherine Page Harden, and others, which looks at two measures. One is impulse control, and one is sensation seeking in girls and boys through the years, starting on the left-hand side from 10 to 11. And what you can see is that impulse, so if you think of these, psychologists refer to these as the gas and the brake, psychologically speaking. So the gas is all about, yes, let's do that, that's a great idea, let's go out, let's jump off that crane. Or, yes, let's have that beer, let's stay out all night, etc. And then impulse control is, no, that's a bad idea, let's not do that. Let's stay in and do our homework. And so what you see is that adolescence is a time when the gas is outrunning the brake a little bit, but very differently for girls and boys. And you see a massive gap for boys, and it takes a very long time for their impulse control to get even close to that for girls. These are averages. Of course, the distributions overlap quite significantly. But I think this is one of the reasons why an education system that rewards sitting still, paying attention, being future-oriented, etc., is inevitably going to favor a group that has more of those skills than the one that doesn't. So in some ways, the fact that girls and women are so far ahead in the education system is not a surprise. In some ways, the education system has always been structured in favor of women and girls. We just didn't know it until we took the brakes off by demolishing some of the artificial barriers that were placed in front of them. Another reason is that we just have so few male teachers and fewer over time. So this shows you the gender breakdown of educators at different levels, from elementary, middle, high, and post-secondary. Basically got to parity now in post-secondary education after many long years of fighting, but only 1 in 10 elementary school teachers are male. K-12 teachers generally, 24% are male, down from 33% in the 80s. And I don't show it here, but in early years education, men are essentially invisible. It's about 3% of early years educators are male, which as a share of the profession is only half as many women flying US military jets. So as a share of the profession, we have twice as many women flying US military jets as we do men teaching kindergarten. To be clear, I'm in favor of more and more women flying military jets. It's instructive that the military are redesigning their jets. They're changing the seats, they're changing the cockpits to allow more women and shorter men to be able to fly those jets, which is great, but I don't see any equivalent redesign going on the other side. And I'll just suggest, perhaps provocatively, that from a social welfare point of view, it's more important to have men in kindergarten classrooms than it is to have women in fighter jet cockpits. To be clear, I just want people who can shoot down the enemy planes, really. But okay, work. I'm not going to say too much about work because I hope our conversation will focus, given the nature of the panel, on education and family. But I do want to say a little bit about work, and I'm conscious that Scott, in particular, will have something to say about this. In 1979, 13% of women earned more than the median man. This shows you this is just the wage distribution, full-time workers in 79, and you can see in orange, that's the female wage distribution, the male wage distribution, they're very different. And at that point, as I say, only 13% of women were above the median man. Now it's 40%. Now 40% is not 50%, but it's a lot more than 13%. And as you can see, the male and female wage distributions look a lot more similar today than they did in 1979. In fact, they look really quite similar, which is an extraordinary achievement. But you'll also see that it's got flatter and pushed out to the right, which is because of this. This just shows you wage trends, and again, half an eye on Scott Winship here, who has strong views on how we measure wages over time. But I don't think there's any disagreement about the pattern, which is much stronger wage growth for women than for men, and much stronger wage growth at the top than at the bottom. And what this shows you is very strong wage growth at the top for women, pretty good in the middle, not so great at the bottom, but for men, not so great overall. So growing wage inequality for both men and women, which means women at the top are doing really well. White women in particular are doing really well. And this shows you weekly wages for white women, black men, and black women. Again, thinking intersectionally here, and what you can see, white men are still way ahead, having had some wage growth. White women have had extraordinarily rapid wage growth and have blown right past black men. Now, for every dollar earned by a white woman, a black man only earns 84 cents. And you can see the rest on the charts there. So again, I show the chart simply to encourage us not to look through a binary lens at what's happening in the labor market. And then in terms of family, which I know we're going to talk about, there's been a profound change. This chart shows you how many, the percentage of households where married couples, dual earner couples, where women earn more than their spouses since the early 70s. This shows you those who are more educated, and that's obviously going to go up given the trends I showed earlier. This shows you the number of households where women are the primary or sole earner. Of course, many of those are single parents. And this shows you the labor force participation of women with children under 6. So in the space of a few decades, we've really transformed the economic relationship between women and men and the economic participation of mothers, and that has had profound consequences for how we think about the structure of the family and how the successful demolition of the ties of economic dependency between women and men, especially mothers, has changed the game. And we're only just beginning to come to terms with what that means for men and what that means for fathers. I'm going to skip that one. One more thing on the labor market, which I hope we'll get into, is some people say, well, there's a lot of occupational segregation. Does that just reflect people's preferences? You know, men and women are different. Women are a bit more into people, men are a bit more into things, etc. And what this paper does is from Rong Su and James Rounds, does something really interesting. It takes the personality profiles of men and women in the US, maps them onto the labor market, and says, in a world where men and women were choosing their occupations in line with their personalities, what percentage of women would we expect to see in these different occupations, which is the orange line, and then what are the actual numbers compared to what the reality is. And I like this chart because what it shows you is there's a number of areas where it's a pretty good match, whereas about the proportion of women you would expect if we assume that those preferences are some way innate, but a number where it really isn't. So I'll take a couple of examples. Like on the left-hand side, engineering, it's gone up a little bit since then. Some conservatives might say, well, of course only 10% of engineers are women. Women's brains aren't into that. And a liberal might say, until we get 50% of engineers are men and women, we won't be in a really gender equal society. And what Rong Su would say is, it's about 30%. And we're only halfway there. At the other end of the spectrum, look at nursing. You'd expect about 30% of nurses to be men, but it's only about 12%. So what this tells me is we shouldn't expect, even in a fully equal society, to get absolute 50-50 in every profession, but we shouldn't use biology as an excuse for very low levels of representation. Last slide. I'm going to rattle literally one line on a bunch of solutions because I want to shut up. Here are some solutions in the book. Not all of them, but there is a selection. Number one, and Kay's just written about this too, we should start boys in school a year later than girls by default. We should redshirt all the boys. They develop later. It would not tilt the playing field in their favor. It would level the playing field from a developmental point of view. We should create 1,000 new technical high schools. We should double the share of students who had access to a technical high school in their school district. By my estimates, federal subsidy of about $5 billion a year should do the job, which is less than 1% of what it would cost to cancel student debt. Seems like a good deal to me. 1 million more apprenticeships, told you. Got to have apprenticeships, but I do happen to believe in them. It's worth saying that those last two will disproportionately help boys and men. There's no evidence they'll particularly help women and girls. Is that a bad thing? No, it's a good thing, given the trends I've just identified. Mass recruitment of male teachers, especially in English, scholarships for men who want to go into early years education, scholarships for men who want to teach English and K-12 education. Intentional public policy to get more men into our classrooms. Subsidies for men entering HEAL, training or jobs. HEAL stands for Health, Education, Administration, and Literacy. It's like the opposite of STEM. We've actually got fewer men in HEAL jobs today and many more women in STEM jobs. So I think we need an equally concerted effort to get more men into these HEAL jobs, which are growing, as we've had to get women into STEM jobs. And last but not least, equal independent paid leave for fathers and mothers. I, in a fit of utopian thinking suggests 6 months for each. As far as I'm aware, only Finland does that right now. But the key point is the principle that the paid leave should be attached independently to the mother and the father and not transferable between the two. And the reason for that is that I believe we need to put fatherhood on a new pedestal, as high as motherhood, but on one that is in tune with the modern world, which requires fatherhood to be seen as an independent social institution that may be expressed through marriage, but is not dependent on marriage. And the reason for that is because of how many more births are now taking place outside marriage. We're up to 40%. Most births to those without a college education are outside marriage. Traditional marriage, based on economic dependency, is in the rearview mirror. And in my view, it is utopian and naive to think that that is the way to reattach men to their children. Instead, we need to attach them more directly to their children through things like paid leave. And then lastly, and inevitably, some blatant self-promotion. This is me, this is my book, this is my Twitter handle, my Substack, etc. Thank you for your attention. Looking forward to the panel.
Right. Head on up here and introduce ourselves. Thank you very much for that presentation, Richard. That was great. Richard's been a great friend for a long time, although even I didn't know how much he hated women. Interesting.
And we're off.
No, I think
Only these two.
I encourage everybody to read the book. I think Richard does a fantastic job of sensitively handling all of the complicated issues involved, celebrating the gains that we've made for women, recognizing that we're not entirely there yet, but also, I think, pointing out this other source of inequality. One of the ways I think Richard is really valuable in the think tank world and the world of public intellectuals is that he has tended to sort of take on topics that aren't quite as fashionable as what a lot of people are writing about. Dream Hoarders, if any of you know his previous book, was basically telling a lot of people who, who I don't necessarily agree with, pointing about the top 1% and how much damage they're doing to the nation, and saying, well, maybe, and it turns out that upper middle class people, like the folks who bought and read his book, are also pulling away from the rest of the country, and that this is an important thing we need to be worried about. Here, I think he's sort of saying the same thing. Like, it's not that we shouldn't be worried about gaps that favor boys and men, but there is this other issue that people aren't talking about enough. So really grateful that he wrote this book. I am going to try to keep this pretty informal so we have time for questions at the end. I think I'll just start out by getting some general impressions. First from Kay Hymowitz. Kay is the William E. Simon Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, former colleague of mine there, contributing editor to City Journal. As Richard mentioned, she's got a book on a related topic called Manning Up. She also, hot off the presses, by which I mean in the last 12 hours, has a new piece up on City Journal's website that is called Where the Boys Aren't, that has remarkable overlap with Richard's book, but they were written completely independently, and I think even though it's up on the web now, most of the writing had been done, I think, before Richard's book came out. So I encourage you to take a look at that. Kate, just your general impressions. We'll talk some more about specifics later on, but I'm curious to hear your general impressions of the book, and then we'll sort of give Richard a chance to jump in after that.
Okay, so first I want to congratulate Richard on what I think is a really important book, and his bravery for taking on a subject that will, in my experience, will leave a lot of scars. Hopefully things have changed, or you do it more gracefully than I did. But it is a contentious topic, or has been, and a difficult one for many people to accept, as he knows. One of the bravest points I think he focuses on is that there is this difference between the sexes. Now, that's brave in this era of drifting pronouns, but he is telling us what I've seen over and over again in my research, that men and women look different, not just in terms of preferences, but in terms of development. And the piece that I now have up on the City Journal website is about exactly that. Richard and I found the same differences between boys and girls in school. I would just add a few details. One is that these differences are to be found all over the world, all over the world. If you look at the OECD numbers, boys are doing worse than girls in all the same ways that they are in the US. They have poor reading scores, more or less equal math, but it's complicated. And their motivation is lower. All of the things that we're concerned about with boys here, they're concerned about there. And even in third world countries where girls didn't even go to school until fairly recently, we're starting to see them take off. And to see a gap grow there. And that, to me, is a further argument for there being something innately different about the learning and development of boys and girls. I think he did it, like I said, Richard did an excellent summary of the article, of the data on education. Again, I would add one other thing. The real area of strength for girls, several, but one of them is reading, verbal skills. And the reason that that matters so much, I mean, I know we always are worried about their performance in STEM, but the reason the reading skills matter so much is because reading is a far stronger predictor of success in school and in the labor market, actually, than math is. There's an interesting paper I quote in the article that's now online on that subject, and I encourage you to look at it. So there's that. And that, again, really appears to be something innate. Boys talk later than girls. Baby boys talk later than girls. They put together sentences later than girls. They have smaller vocabularies. We're talking about way before any socialization could take place or is likely to have taken place. There's some people who say, oh no, it's because the mothers talk to their girls more than their boys. I don't think that could possibly make that big a difference if you look. And again, this is worldwide, so it really does suggest this is not just cultural. And then they, not only do they talk more, not only do they do they make more complex sentences, but their boys are more likely to have stuttering problems, to be autistic, other kinds of communication issues. And that, so I think when we start to look at this mass of data, we can see pretty specifically what's going on, that girls have a certain amount of verbal facility that boys generally don't. And any of you who have sons or remember being sons know that when you come home from school and mom says, well, what'd you do? What happened today? You say, nothing. That's partly a boy thing. It's not just. I've seen girls do it too, but it's more of a boy thing. And I'll make one other point, and then I'll give it over to Beth. I think that also one of the changes in marriage that's happened over the last 50, maybe 60 years that maybe we didn't quite fully understand is that language has become much more important. You have to discuss there's so much negotiation that needs to go on when you don't have scripts, right? Gender scripts. And I have the theory that one of the reasons that we're seeing marriages not work among lower income people is because those roles were easy before. They are no longer easy. You got to figure it out. There's a lot of disagreement about how it should work. And there are, not everybody has that facility. So this works to the advantage of educated people who want to marry. And indeed, marriages are taking place and lasting longer for educated people, and I do think that that is one of the reasons. Now, women may complain about this quite a bit, right? By the way, they say we have to do all the emotional labor, but that is, that's part of the negotiation that you have to make in a modern marriage. So I'll leave it there for now.
That's really fascinating. I'm struck too, so you talked mostly about the biological differences in terms of cognitive skills and learning. The non-cognitive differences have been the ones, once I became a parent, for those of you who are not parents yet, you will become a biological determinist to some extent.
Happens to everybody.
Upon becoming parents. I would take my daughter to pre-K, and there was a period, 10-minute period, where we could read to our child quietly to get them prepared for the day. I just remember one of the boys, we'll call him Kevin, it's not his real name, would sit on my head as I was trying to read to my daughter. Later, my daughter bumped into him and broke her arm, neither here nor there. But Kevin, I think, was very educational for me in terms of pointing out the importance of biological differences. Richard, maybe before we go to you, we'll go to Beth. So Beth is my colleague here at AI. She's a senior fellow. She really likes to work with me. We were both at the Brookings Institution. We were both at the Manhattan Institute. We're both here.
That's right.
You're just following you.
Yes, exactly. I don't know where we're going next, but
Yeah,
I look forward
I'll
to
let you.
it.
I'll give you a heads up. But,
Okay,
That's your
please.
script. Your script. Follow Scott.
Exactly right. I don't have to think about things. Yeah, if we don't have to negotiate, it just works out.
Beth is the author of Making College Pay, An Economist Explains How to Make a Smart Bet on Higher Education, and an expert on higher education and workforce development. Beth, what were your big picture impressions of the book?
Yeah, great. You know, I come to read this book from two identities. One as a scholar, which you just described, an economist, and study higher education generally, and also as a relatively new boy mom. I have a 4.5-year-old son and a 9-month-old son. I'm also the product of sort of an East Coast upbringing and the ideas about gender that came along with that, in terms of not wanting to recognize the innate differences between men and women, and really living, I think, the first at least 25, 30 years of my life with those ideas ingrained. And there was a quote I wanted to read from a review of Richard's book in The Guardian. This is by Andrew Anthony. He wrote, "We live in an age in which there is a growing conviction that gender, and indeed biological sex itself, is a social imposition from which we are able to liberate ourselves." Now, I was a math major, I studied engineering courses in high school, and I thought, well, heck, I'm liberating myself from the expectations. Why can't the men do that too? And then I had a son, and there was a turning point. My son was about 2 years old. He took a plastic cup of water, he finished drinking it, and then he spiked it like it was the football, and he had just won the Super Bowl. And my husband likes to identify that as the point when I released myself of these ideas about gender. It was a turning point in our marriage, as well as in my understanding of these issues. I think the greatest value in this book for me and for, socially, is that, for those who haven't had that experience of watching their 2-year-old son spike their water cup, it gives permission for us to recognize these differences. And I think one of Richard's strengths is his grace in delivering this message. I know, Kate, you have struggled with delivering this message for a long time as well, and it does take a certain grace to get people to be able to internalize this message without dismissing it. And I think it also offers us a new way to interpret maleness without turning to pejorative terms like toxic masculinity and, maybe selfishly motivated. I'm looking for a new way of interpreting maleness for the sake of raising successful sons. Something that was striking to me was much of the motivation of the book is about identifying these differences in outcomes across boys and girls. And I don't think that Richard makes this mistake, but I think there's a potential for interpretation of this sort of discussion that we need to achieve parity across boys and girls, men and women. And I think that's, exactly opposite to the point that you're really making, but a danger. And I think that we should be embracing those differences and also embracing differences in outcomes. And of course, the study that you highlighted even today identifies that we're not looking for parity in enrollment in these different occupations, but rather parity with some natural proclivity for those occupations. And so I think that's really important to highlight. In terms of understanding implications for higher education, which is, where I'm an expert beyond just being a parent of a boy, I think what this emphasizes is the need for us diversifying our system of higher education and having diverse pathways to career. I'm often railing on a regulatory system for higher education as demanding that institutions and programs of study be too homogenous. And literally one of the requirements for institutions and programs to have access to federal student aid dollars is something called seat time. And as we've just discussed, it seems that girls and women are better at seat time than boys. So I appreciate that you emphasize apprenticeship as an opportunity for embracing these differences, and I think it's apprenticeships, but also embracing greater diversity in our post-secondary education system, and thinking broadly about pathway to career, pathway to economic thriving, rather than narrowly focusing on educational outcomes.
That's great. Richard, I don't know if you want to respond to anything that's been said so far. Or?
Yeah, sure. Thank you both for those thoughtful comments, which obviously based on, you've obviously both read the book, which is great. I'll make a few observations and reactions, really. I mean, I'll start with Kay's first point about bravery. And it's one of these, I think it's become a bit overused, this term now. It's almost a little bit of a thing that public intellectuals are like, oh, you're so brave. And I don't think it's a brave book, honestly. It's true that a lot of people advised against it, but that just made me more determined to write it, but not because I wanted nasty tweets or difficult emails or difficult exchanges, but because I thought, wow, if I can't write it, then who can? And you get this vicious circle where it's just like, you can't write about that. So the only people who are willing to write about it are a self-selected group, and so the cycle turns. And so you particularly don't get people who are coming at it from a broadly, centrist or liberal perspective writing about it, because God forbid that they would write about it. And so that made me think I should write about it. But I'll tell you my little trick, if I ever find myself, and so far I'm pleased with the reception across the board, but I conjure the image of my great-grandfather, who was badly wounded in the Battle of the Somme in World War I. And I conjure him. I wasn't able to go back to his job as a miner as a result of his injuries in the trenches. And I bring him back, and I envisage a conversation where I explain to him that some really nasty tweets were written about me today. And how brave I am to write this Brookings Institution Press book and talk about it at AEI. And I try to imagine his reaction. And that helps me. I think this point about differences is important because that's why I put the chart up from Wrong Sue more generally. I can't remember who said that so many of our problems stem from the inability to think about overlapping distributions, right? Whereas most people in the real world know that distributions overlap. Yeah. And so I want to get to a point where we can acknowledge differences on average, but also celebrate the differences within the groups, right? So it's not like to be a man, you have to be this way. It shouldn't be determinative and prescriptive. But we don't get there by denying any differences at all. And so we want to get to a world, this is the great thing about liberal societies, is that you can have general rules, right? Most people identify as masculine or feminine in line with their biological sex. Some people don't, and some people transition. The word transition is informative, like by definition, you're moving from one thing to another. And that's great. And we want to live in a world where you can have general rules and exceptions to those rules, and both can be honored. And both can be accepted. You don't have to deny one in order to get the other. And so I think that's the point that I think we need to get from this debate, and it's where most people are. Why it seems a difficult conversation, I think, is people wonder where you're going with this stuff, right? They say, well, where are you going? It's not the first thought or the first chart or the second thought, it's the fourth or fifth one they're anticipating, which is, it's the fault of those feminists. We told you the women's movement would be a disaster, etc. And so it's incredibly important from the outset to say that's obviously not what we're doing here. But to give people that reassurance in order to kind of create this space. And I think that continuing to push on the areas where there is still a lot of work to do for women and girls allows you to then say, hey, we can do both. So one of the constant refrains of the book, we can think two thoughts at once. Whether that's true or not is an interesting question. My colleague Shadi Hamid sent an interesting tweet where he said, I'm reading my colleague Richard Reeves' book, and I've already found an error on page 2. And he highlighted it, and it was that sentence. We can think two thoughts at once. But actually, of course we can think two thoughts at once. Of course we can think there are some problems that are specific to women and girls and some that are more specific to boys and men. And it's a gift of the women's movement we can actually have this conversation. We couldn't have this conversation 30 years ago. We still couldn't have it in much of the world. But we can have it now, and we can have it here. And we can do it without giving up any of our prior commitments to women's rights. And the only thing I have to say about Beth raising her boys, I'm a few years ahead of you. I don't like the phrase toxic masculinity for reasons we could get into, but I do think that I don't think we should completely deconstruct the ideas of masculinity and femininity altogether. They shouldn't be determinative. I would like a world where they're a bit less weighty in some ways, but they're getting more weighty because of all the attention that's being paid to issues around gender. And I like to think instead about what does mature masculinity look like. I think the difference between immature masculinity and mature masculinity is an important one. I'd say the same for femininity. And really, it's a question of growing up. It's how do we grow up, and how do we help boys become men and girls become women, and that's a task as old as human history. But we don't help that task if we don't acknowledge that A, the task has to be undertaken, and B, if we make the mistake of toxifying either one or the other.
I want to talk about one of the less empirical, more cultural, philosophical parts of your book that I was really struck by. And it's in the chapter that you describe the problem of, quote, dislocated dads. So I'll just read a couple of quotes, and then we can sort of jump into some questions that they raise. So you write, the economic reliance of women on men held women down, but it also propped men up. Now the props are gone, and many men are falling. You also write, a man who knows he must provide for a wife and children has a clear sense of how to be, quote, purposeful and, quote, whole. And this is in part of an argument about how men are sort of a bit lost in the modern world, that for millennia, our job was basically to kill saber-toothed tigers, be providers, and that the role for women was to do the child rearing and gathering. I'm not an anthropologist, but essentially that women have a much more rich, complex role in the modern world, where they are caregivers, but they also play an important role as providers as well. Whereas for men, there hasn't really been much to fill in that space. Essentially, we're still supposed to be providers, but that is less necessary in the modern world than it once was, and it's creating all these issues. So the sort of problem of men's identities and purposeful roles, in your policy discussion, you focus on specifically restoring the role of fathers. You take it as a given that we can't really bring back the strength of marriage in the way that we used to, and so instead we should revitalize fatherhood. So for sake of provocation, sometimes you seem actually to be most concerned with revitalizing fatherhood for the sake of men, for their identities, their roles, rather than for the sake of kids and boys in particular. So the question I want to throw out to the group is sort of, how much should we worry about, what do folks think about revitalizing fatherhood as distinct from marriage, and the importance in general of family structure trends for the educational gaps and the other gaps that we're seeing among boys?
So I agree with two things. Number one, that fatherhood brings a great sense of purpose and meaning to men, and that the loss of that, I should say, established role. I mean, there are many men who are taking on new responsibilities as dads, especially among upper income people. There's no question in my mind that loss of, we need you, you're needed, the dependency did create a sense of need, has been a problem for men. The other, though, the real problem that I had with some of that discussion in Richard's book is that when you don't have a residential father, what it means is that often, usually, the mother is looking for another romantic partner. I mean, this is just, the fact is everybody's looking for love. You have the mother looking for another romantic partner. You have the father already looking for another partner. And guess what? There will be more children. So what happens so often, and it's especially true with non-married couples, is that they create what is sometimes called a complex family. That complex family makes this non-residential fatherhood a very problematic thing for a variety of reasons. One is there may be another man in the house when dad comes back to visit with his children, and he may have problems with him. And that dad may have his own kids that he has in the house, and the first dad may not like those kids or may not like the way the kids are acting. So there are all kinds of complexities that happen, both emotional, logistically, and so forth, when you have these complex families. So that, although I agree, I'm quite pessimistic about bringing back marriage for the large number of Americans for whom it's really dead. They don't even know long married couples. I'm very pessimistic about it. At the same time, I don't see how we revive fatherhood without having residential fathers. And I'll make one more point. Chetty's research, one of his papers, discusses how children are more likely to be upwardly mobile in communities where there are lots of dads. That is, residential dads. So it's not just the individual kids that gain from having father in the house. It's not just the man who gained from it. The whole community does. So that's my beef with that argument.
So, but what's interesting, of course, is that that research finds that doesn't have to be your dad, right? So it's just dads in the community.
Right.
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 And so I think that speaks to what some people call social fathers, or et cetera. So I think that actually speaks to the fact that you can have these fatherhood roles which aren't based on residence, right? It was dads who weren't living with the kids, they weren't even their own dads. They were just in the community.
But you needed to have those dads in the community.
Sure, but they didn't have to be living with the children, right?
Yes,
so
that's true.
Was my interpretation. That was my interpretation of the result. So firstly, Scott has a review of the book in Education Next, is that right? Which goes into some of this. I thoroughly recommend it. It's actually a very, very thoughtful review. I think this point about scripts that Kay's already mentioned is hugely important. So to the extent, I'm socially conservative enough to think that scripts are useful, even if they're not determinative. And so we did have strong scripts for my parents, right? They had a very egalitarian marriage, but they knew the script. When my dad became unemployed, he was the one that had to get another job, right? So it was very clear division of labor. And I think we sort of tore up those old scripts for very good reason, because they were founded on the economic dependency of women on men. We replaced the script for women with a new script: educational empowerment, economic independence, you go girl, etc. And I love that. Absolutely love it. I love seeing it I don't have daughters, but in my goddaughters and my son's friends. I love this sense of energy and purpose and empowerment that women have, young women. It's amazing to see. But what's the script for men now? So we also tore up the male script. And so you end up, and I love your thought about what you end up, if you're not a script, you have to improvise, and improvising is hard. So you're thrust into the middle of the stage, the script has been torn up, what do? You improvise. Improvising a life is difficult. And that's, I think, what a lot of men are doing now, and I think that some of the work on the haphazard self from Catherine Eden and so on is hugely helpful there. On the fatherhood point, I strongly believe that it's the relationship between the fathers and children that matters, not the residential arrangements. I am perfectly willing to concede, and that's true for mothers too, And there's some evidence that fathers who are not co-resident with the mother but have a strong relationship with their kids, those kids do better than fathers who are resident with the mother but have a very distant relationship with their kids. And so, to me, there's at least some evidence that it's the quality of the relationship, the engagement that matters. Now, I'll concede that's easier if you're co-resident, right? I just think it would be crazy to deny that, to that fact. But it's not necessary. And in a world where we've successfully broken the ties of economic dependency that lay at the heart of traditional marriage, I think we have no choice. And I say this as kind of negatively now, but I see it as a positive, but to rebuild family relations on a different model, which is not an indirect relationship between fathers and children mediated through the mother. And my model is like of a dotted line from the dad to the kids, like in an org chart, right? It was at best a dotted line. It's got to be a straight line. And so that may well lead to more marriage. My view is that the reason upper middle class marriage is doing so well is not because the women who are upper middle class American women, arguably the most economically powerful women in the history of the world, they're getting married. Why are they getting married? That is literally the opposite of what Gloria Steinem predicted, right? She didn't say, once these women get all this economic power, they're all going to be flocking to get married and stay married. She said the opposite. And so it's completely the opposite of what was predicted by the leaders of the women's movement. Why? Kids. They want to raise kids together. They want to have a kid with the person they've chosen to have kids with. It's a joint venture for parenting. And it's a very, very effective one, which is one reason why you might have more grey divorce. When the kids leave, you're more likely to divorce then. And so I think that upper middle class parents are totally bought into the importance of both parents, so they will be co-resident for it. But it's founded actually on the importance of fatherhood and motherhood, not on the economic tie that used to bind men and women together as parents. So I think my call for reinventing fatherhood is quite utopian, but it's less utopian than thinking we can bring back traditional marriage.
There's your headline statement from the event, I think. Beth, let's squeeze in one more question before we get to Q&A. Curious about your thoughts on Richard's policy ideas for education, which I have listed as sort of redshirting being the default for boys, which Richard has snuck in a sort of an additional year of universal pre-K for the boys also.
Yes,
Technical high schools, more technical high schools and apprenticeships, more male teachers. How do you feel about those? And maybe the big one that wasn't mentioned, which is sort of single-sex schooling as an option.
Yeah, no, great points. You know, I think Richard had a line in the book where he said that he'll propose redshirting, and the wonks in DC will, you know, bicker over where the evidence is, and we need to do these evaluations. And I think it was teachers, you said, would wholly embrace this idea. Now, as a mother, I'm investigating how to redshirt my son. As a researcher, I'm more cautious in terms of thinking of this as a universal policy. You know, I do think that in terms of this being a default policy recommendation, there's definitely a lot more work that needs to be done. It also seems like something that would not be too challenging to study in further detail, so that's an optimistic thing. You know, the embracing more male teachers, I think, would be really valuable, and the research seems very clear on that. You know, I have no opposition to that as a recommendation, and I think the notion that Richard injects a few times in the book is that we have put resources towards recruiting more women into STEM, and why not put resources towards recruiting men into HEAL? I mean, I think that's a very compelling argument, and I don't see any rational opposition to it. So I, for the most part, embrace largely what he has recommended.
Excellent.
Do you want me to respond? I mean, of course, I agree with the bits where you agree with me. I agree with all of that. The truth is, like on the redshirting proposal, one of the big arguments is, look, there's a lot of girls who are not developmentally right at that point. It's very crude. It's an incredibly, very blunt tool. To which I say, yes, that's true. But based on my reading of most measures of development, there's more overlap between one grade and the grade above or below than there is between boys and girls within a grade. So yes, it's a blunt tool, and we use it now. Like, who says 5 is right, right? It's right for some kids, but not others. But I'll be honest, and I say this in the book, like, if President Biden watches this, which he's probably watching now, and calls us up and says, got it, fine, I'm going to pass a law saying, okay, we're going to register all the boys by law, maybe give them an extra year of pre-K. I would say, wait, evaluate. Let's try it on a trial basis. Let's see. And there are a few places, I think, where we've got some natural experiments we can start to look at. So I wouldn't say go for it, right? I'd say I think it's and Kay and I have both written about this and say in the same way, I think worth considering. It puts on the table this difference, which Kay made the point. The big difference in the development of male and female brains is not how they develop, it's when they develop. And there's no controversy about that. And so should we in some way incorporate that into our education system? Maybe. But if President Biden calls and says, I got it, scholarships for men into K-12 teaching, and especially into English. So it turns out the evidence is strongest for male teachers teaching English to boys, in the same way that female teachers teaching STEM is great. What is the subject that K-12 male teachers are least likely to be teaching? English. And so, like, very targeted subsidies and scholarships to get more men teaching English in our middle and high schools seems to me to be honestly a no-brainer. I'd say go for it. And if you said, got it, I'll spend $5 billion creating 1,000 new technical high schools, I'd say, got it. And he'll say, and I'm going to call the Senate and kick them about why the apprenticeship bill has been sitting fallow for a year in the Senate and get that bill passed, I'd say, go for it. So I'm being honest about the fact I have different degrees of confidence about some of the policy proposals.
You know, and I'll also push you a little bit further too. I think you did dismiss the idea of single gender schooling, and I think that was based on some evidence from existing applications of that. I felt like that could go a little further in terms of, you know, just given my intimate understanding of the differences between preschool age boys and girls at this point, it seemed like the notion of more gender-specific curriculum development was a bit underexplored, and I wondered if you wanted to
Well, I
speak
could
about
do that within schools, maybe, rather than between schools.
Yeah.
I just don't see the evidence. I'm not against it. I don't see the evidence is particularly powerful. There's some good meta-analysis. There's foreign data, you know, international data. So I'm not against it, but I have to tell you, the people who say that the idea of like starting boys in the same schools a year later than girls is a radical idea. Imagine separating boys from girls throughout the public education system, right? So it's always going to be a marginal thing.
Right, and I think your concession was that the introduction of more men into the classroom as teachers would sort of naturally move the curriculum in that direction. And you also talk about you had a caregiver for your children who set up a math tent, I think it was, for when they were doing their homework. And that may be that those are the sort of tweaks that are necessary and don't require, you know, a completely different curriculum.
I'd rather make the existing system more male-friendly than create a whole new system.
And that may be all it takes. Yeah.
That's what I hope.
And I would add one more thing that could make it more male-friendly that maybe is a little too predictable. Please don't hold that against me, but phonics. Will work much better. I think even more important than having
big debate in the UK about that now, actually, for that reason.
All right, so Beth, I think you need to get your education policy community to convince a private school or a no excuses charter school to start this redshirting thing. We can evaluate it in
right away.
20 years.
Put in a call today.
Thank you.
Fantastic. I've done my work today. Okay, we've got time for questions. Folks on Twitter, if you have questions, I will try to get any of those in, but we have a bunch of people here who showed up, so I'm going to automatically be biased in their favor. First hand I saw right here.
I have a question.
Oop, can you wait for the mic? Yeah, there you go.
Hi, thank you for writing this book. I was also intrigued by David Brooks's column a few weeks ago on your book as well. I'm going to side with Beth with respect to single-sex schools, because I think that is a powerful approach in which boys can be around other boys of their age, and they don't have to deal with girls at a younger age. I think that's like I said, a very powerful approach. In addition, I think the concept of co-ed education, specifically with either high school or college, beginning in the early 70s, I think, with your graph that you showed, it seemingly has taken off more specifically for girls than it has for boys, because again, having women in classes, I think actually serves as a deterrent for boys. Secondly, second and thirdly,
Well,
the
hopefully
concept,
there'll be a question too.
the concept of mentoring seemingly is lacking for boys and men, and more specifically, the concept of men's clubs also have disappeared, where women's clubs and women's organizations have accelerated. So take all or either, or among all three of those concepts.
So I mean, we've had a brief discussion about single sex. I'm not against it. I just don't think it's, I don't see the evidence being anywhere near strong enough to justify public expenditure on single sex schools. And I think in some ways it's because people are getting a bit desperate about how boys are doing in the mainstream education system and starting to look for those alternatives. But I think let's reform the mainstream education system, because you can bet that the people who are going to be able to select into single sex schools are probably not the boys who are struggling most. There'll be some exceptions to that rule, and so I'd much rather focus my attention and time and resources on getting more men into our schools, more applied learning styles that will suit boys, etc., than on boys-only education. I also think it might be a reaction, I'll say one more thing, to this, the absence of male-only spaces and boy-only spaces, that people are looking for that, and they're not finding it in places they used to find it, and so they're thinking, let's do it through the education system then. So one example is the Scout movement. Mackenzie Scott just gave $85 million to the Girl Scouts of America because they have girl-only places to learn STEM, etc. One of the reasons that they need money is because the Boy Scouts of America just went co-ed and rebranded themselves BSA in the hope that, like IBM, people will forget what the initials used to stand for. Used to be boys. And so actually you don't have like single-sex scouting for boys anymore, but you do for girls. And I know why there's been this reaction against male-only spaces. I think there's good historical reasons to be skeptical of them. But I'm very worried, actually, that we're kind of just squeezing them out altogether, especially during those crucial years of adolescence. There is a case for male-only spaces and female-only spaces in certain times and in certain ways. But I don't think we have to reorganize the entire education system in order to achieve it.
Right here.
Thank you for being here. I'll admit up front that I've yet to read the book, but I greatly enjoyed you on. But I enjoyed you on the podcast Common Sense quite a lot. And so, two things I'd love to get your perspective on, and I'm sorry if it's covered in the book. One thing that's been pointed out is that there's been kind of a marked decline in testosterone levels in men. This may be a red herring. People think it's everything from microplastics to soy to obesity to smoking. But is there anything there that's worth talking about or that might interact? And the second would be kind of the marked difference in trait agreeableness between men and women, where men tend to have far less agreeableness just as a rule. How does that interact with the kind of structures we're talking about economically in the workplace or in education in general?
Well, there was someone said on Twitter that they'd listened to me on 5 podcasts and then decided to buy the book. It's like, wow, pretty high bar, isn't it? 5. Wow, okay. Back to the microphone.
We've sold at least one book, I think, just in the last hour.
5 hours in from one person to buy one book. I think the testosterone thing is largely a red herring. I mean, first of all, I just think the evidence is not that strong for the drop. Secondly, it's not clear why it matters. And it's just mostly just a scam to get men who are worried about themselves to buy stupid pills that they're having advertised to them. It's like, the problem is that you've got low T. No, it isn't. And to the extent that it is the reasons you're talking about, which is it's related to be healthier, right? It's clear that if you're unhealthy, your testosterone levels go down. But on agreeableness, it's a good opportunity to just say again, distributions overlap. Is it true that if you take the male and female distributions, that everything else equal, women tend to score a bit higher on agreeableness? Yes. but it's a really, really overlapping distribution. I know lots of really disagreeable women and lots of really agreeable men. And so
Tell us about them, Richard.
Yeah, name names. We want names.
Well, there's one who's, some people are willing to say publicly, I'm very disagreeable. But there aren't many people who are willing to say it publicly. And I'm actually too agreeable in many ways, right? And so they overlap. Does it mean that under conditions of absolute equality that you're going to see some selecting into, say, occupations that tend to fit better with more agreeableness? Yes. But it's not going to be like 90-10, right? There are some professions where that might be true, but overall, I think that my real fear is that when people use biological arguments, is that they're overweighting them for what I would consider to be reactionary ends. Of course, the other side just ignore to say they don't exist altogether, but I think it's just incredibly important that those differences can be weaponized, and people are right to be nervous about them. And so if I'm hiring someone into a job that needs agreeableness, my son is an early years educator, and of course, right, there are differences, which might mean on average, we're not going to get 50% of early years educators going to be men, but I'm furious when he's discriminated against because he's male, because I think he does have the skill set and the personality to do it. And I'd be furious if someone discriminated against Beth because if she wants an engineering or an econ job, right? Because on average, there are those differences.
Well, so much for the bravery if you're not going to name names. Let's go.
Everyone knows people in their lives.
Thank you so much for the book and your research on this. I wanted to ask, there's some evidence that gay men are performing well and
Yes.
not having a big problem.
Yes.
Does that, first of all, what's your finding there? And does that point to whether this is a biological or cultural problem, seeing as gay men seem to be doing as well as women? And is this only a straight male problem then?
Yeah, I don't tackle that question, but the book is squarely aimed at cis heterosexual men. But yeah, you're right. There's some evidence that if American gay men were a country, they'd be the best educated country in the world. Am I getting that right? And I don't really know how to interpret that, honestly. I think because there's all kinds of selection effects potentially going on there, which is who's willing to come out, willing to declare that they are, what kind of their social and economic backgrounds are, etc. So I'd want to know more about it. But I think what it speaks to is just like the gloriousness of diversity. Let's put it that way, which is like, that's great. There are some people who are going against all kinds of stereotypes and allowing for this kind of kaleidoscope to exist without denying that there are differences. So we're kind of back to where we started. There's also some evidence that some of my colleagues that have been working on, Beyond Deng has done some work on these heel jobs with me at Brookings. And there's some kind of initial evidence there that you might see of the men who are like in those more heel professions, that a disproportionate share of them may well be gay. And so that's interesting too, because what that suggests is that there are kind of some men who are kind of breaking down these barriers, but it might be men who've already broken down other barriers. And what we need is to kind of follow their lead and get to a place where more men are able to get into those professions too.
Right here.
Thank you so much all for taking the time to speak with us today. I'm curious, there's been a lot of conversation about scripts and the importance of scripts being a guidance, even if they're not meant to be followed to a T necessarily. And Richard, you brought up the fact that while traditional scripts for both men and women have been broken down, in many ways women were introduced a new script in the form of, sort of you go girl, I'm in a workforce, get an education. I'm wondering, do you think that a new script for men is required for them, and what would that
Did you say, is it required for them?
Yes, and what would that look like to you if one hasn't already been proposed?
You go, boy.
Or do you want to let Kay or Beth have a
No,
go at it first?
no, I want to hear your script.
Okay, do you want to have a go at it first?
Do you know
No. Well, it's interesting. I mean, like I have been writing about it, so we need, like, I think we do need a new script. And so I wrote an article for somebody a couple of weeks ago saying, like, we need a new script. And they came back and said, yeah, what is it? Like, yeah, that's a good question.
It's not you go boy. That's all.
It's definitely not that. But, and of course, because one of the criticisms of a lot of the work that's done in this space is that it's all about culture. Everything's about culture, right? And that's true to some extent, but I didn't want to do too much hand-waving in the book. I wanted it to be quite earnest, quite policy-oriented, quite crunchy, quite like, here are some problems. Here are a bunch of people not solving it. Here are some solutions, right? To be quite straightforward. Matthew Iglesias had a long review, and he described the book as earnest, bordering on banal. And he meant it as a compliment, and I took it as a compliment. Because I do think there's like, oh, it's all culture. But that said, a lot of it is culture. So I think the script has to be, the script for mature masculinity, I think has to be based around, first of all, educational excellence, but in a way that is kind of more, perhaps more male-oriented. I'm really worried that the very idea of educational success is going to be seen as a feminine characteristic. And so I do think that's why I want more male teachers. It's why I want all more opportunities. So I think it's part of like at school and in these educational environments, just to say like, I want the same message of empowerment going to boys in our schools now as we have going to our girls. I think it's a hugely important part of it. I think secondly, it's about purpose and being under your own steam. I think that's like, it is harder now, no question, right? We can't just follow a script. You are having to improvise a little bit more. So that means being under your own steam, having your own sense of like where you're going. It's hard. It was much easier for the previous generation, just follow the script. And I see it in my own sons. Yeah, I've told the story of like one of my sons stopped out of college because he was offered a job as an esports coach to go and coach a professional video games team, right? Which was his dream. And I said, what's the deal? He said, well, they'll fly me to Las Vegas, give me a free apartment, and pay me $50,000 a year, plus bonuses. I said, go for it. Of course you should go and do that. It's your dream. And like the idea that we had anything to do with that. In fact, we were an obstacle to that. Because it's his dream. He's following it. And I think the sense of agency and purpose is a big part of it. So like the horrible phrase, like you be you, kind of follow your own, like that's really necessary in boys. And last thing I'll talk about is fatherhood. Like I think this new script for mature masculinity, we've already talked about this, has to be based around the central importance of dads matter, period. Not just as breadwinners, period. And if you want to be a dad, you want to be engaged in your kids' lives, go for it. By the way, that will mean you'll have to mate successfully. That will mean you'll have to find some kind of relationship. And that also is about purpose. Last thing I'll say, there's a survey question, which is what are you looking for in a partner? Right? They ask women and men, and like being a economic potential is ranked higher among women choosing men than the other way around. And I had a colleague, I have some colleagues in the audience now, some of whom were in this conversation. And I said, how do you interpret this? It's like even young women are still saying, look, I want a guy with economic potential. And this colleague said to me, she said, what they want is someone who has it together. And someone who's going to be a joint partner, shoulder to shoulder, fully engaged. And that question is a proxy for that. And I think that's right. So I think that sense of just being under your own steam, having agency and having purpose that's not restricted to breadwinning, that's at least the message I'm trying to pass on to my kids.
Any other quick ideas on scripts?
Well, I would put the partner searching before the fatherhood.
Well, it does require it, I guess.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
especially for men.
That whole area, like I will say, like I kept the chapter in on biology that you liked, Kay, even though some people said cut it out. The chapter I did not put in was the chapter on sex.
Oh, I think I read that.
And mating and romance.
And we're out of time.
Unfortunately, we can't get into that today.
So I wanted to read one question from the web, which was, I'm squinting here, what price deflator did you use on your chart for wage trends?
Is that from a Winship family member?
Obscure.
PCE.
I wish we could do more questions. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you all for coming. We've got books over here on the side, which our honored guest will be signing. So would encourage you to head over that way, and would encourage you to read the book. Thanks very much.